Zachary Goldman. I'm the Executive Director of the Center on Law and Security, and I'm very, very pleased that you are all able to join us this evening for what will be a very interesting and informative discussion. It's a real pleasure for me to welcome our group this evening, Samara Moore from the National Security Staff, Bob Kolaski from the Department of Homeland Security, and Naomi Lefkowitz and John Boyens from the National Institute for Standards and Technology, NIST, to discuss the cybersecurity framework that was released by the government last month. And what everyone is, and certainly not least Michael Coden of Next9, who will be moderating the evening's discussion. The framework that was released a couple of weeks ago is in many respects new and in many respects old. New because it was the product of the executive order published in February of 2013 by the president to address cyber critical infrastructure protection. And old because it is part of an ongoing conversation that has gone on for the last several years about the ways in which we can best protect ourselves against a variety of cybersecurity harms, but most importantly, harms to the critical infrastructure system that make our society function every day. These kinds of issues are very much at the core of what we focus on here at the center, the ways in which public and private are thinking through new ways to work together to address new threats. And so it's a real honor and a real pleasure to have everybody here this evening. So beyond thanking all of you for making the trip down, I'd like to thank some of the other folks that have made the evening possible. Michael and Next9, as I had mentioned, but also SourceFire, Dell, and Rockwell Automation, all of whose support for the event tonight. It was really critical and welcome. So we will begin with a slideshow for a little while and have a conversation with the folks on the panel, and then open things up to Q&A and discussion, and we'll try and wrap up here around 8. So again, thank you very much for coming, and I'd like to hand over the microphone to Michael Coden. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Zach. And I'd like very much to thank the NYU Center for Law and Security for hosting us this evening. This is a very exciting event for us. The Apple technology is not foolproof. My iPad has crashed, so I'm going to have to do this from memory. So, I actually have did a master's degree in mathematics down the street here at the Quran Institute, and one of my professors during that time developed a new theory of particle physics, which was so important he was asked to travel from college to college and university all over the United States and lecture about this new theory of particle physics. To facilitate this arduous schedule, he hired a chauffeur in a limousine, and the chauffeur would drive him from college to college, sit in the back of the room while the professor gave his lecture. And one day after 3 months, the chauffeur turned to the professor and said, "You know, Professor, I've heard your lecture so many times, I could give it word for word." The professor said, "You know, I'm kind of tired of giving that lecture." So they stopped in a gas station, exchanged clothes, and the chauffeur was driven into the next college by the professor in the chauffeur's uniform. The professor sat in the back of the room. The chauffeur gave the lecture on nuclear physics, and he gave it word for word correct. He received a standing ovation after his speech. And then the first graduate student got up and asked a detailed theoretical question. The chauffeur didn't hesitate a second. He looked the young graduate student straight in the eye, and he said, "Young man, that's a stupid question. And to show you just how stupid it is, my chauffeur, who's sitting in the back of the room, is going to answer it for you." Well, Cyber weapons are as sophisticated as nuclear particle physics, and the damage that they can do can be similar. But cybersecurity actually can be a lot simpler, and I think the cybersecurity framework that NIST, DHS, and the United States government and the White House have put together show that in a great way and enable people to do a much better job of protecting our country. I think we're deeply honored to have with us the 4 of the people who worked very, very much on that cybersecurity framework. Samara Moore is the Director of Critical Infrastructure, Cybersecurity on the National Security Staff of the White House. She previously developed the cybersecurity capability maturity model for the Department of Energy. Before that, worked for the occupational for OSHA. It's easier to say, and has a bachelor's degree from Virginia Tech and a master's degree from George Washington University, where she is currently an adjunct professor. We have with us Bob Kolaski, who, I can't read. I'm going to have to resort to my phone here.
I was going to be very impressed if you remembered everyone's
the titles are so long in the federal government.
Let's just grant that we're here and we're important people, and then we're good to go.
Yeah. So Bob. Okay. So
we'll
Bob,
describe what we do a little.
Bob's with DHS, John Boyens with NIST, and Naomi Lefkowitz is the lady who headed up the privacy section of the cybersecurity framework. So we're going to have a really good deep dive on the privacy tonight. I'm so glad you could all be here, and what I'll do is just turn it over to Samara before I further embarrass myself.
You're fine. So thank you all for coming here this evening and ending your day with us. We appreciate it, and we appreciate the opportunity to talk to different communities. This is our 3rd event today, and each one has had a different set of stakeholders and attendees, and we walk away from each event learning something. So I wanted to talk just a few minutes, and I'm really going to share my talk with my colleagues here. But I wanted to start off with a few remarks on why we're here and why we're doing this. As you are aware, cyber threats are taking advantage of the way we're using technology today. Cyber threats aren't necessarily new. And as you look at the approach, and not necessarily the approach, but you look at some of the practices that we're promoting in the framework, those aren't necessarily new. But what we are seeing is increased use of technology, increased connectivity, both internal to organizations and with our business partners. And this change is a concern for us in managing cyber risk. We're concerned about the risk posed to national security, economic security, public health, and public safety. So similar to financial risk and reputational risk, cyber risk has the potential to impact a company's bottom line by driving up cost and negatively impacting revenue. We are concerned clearly, when we talk about the scope of critical infrastructure, we're concerned with delivery of critical services and the integrity of those services. But we're also concerned about an organization's ability to innovate. We're concerned about theft of intellectual property. We're concerned about theft of sensitive data or customer data. So the cyber threats aren't targeted at just one type of organization. This is something that we're working to address across government and industry. In particular, we're concerned about some of the trends that we're seeing, and I'll highlight just 3. First, the cyber threat is becoming more diverse. We're seeing it farther, as I stated earlier. We're using technology more. We're benefiting a lot from the use of that technology, but with that comes cyber threats that we have to be concerned with. So that means the surface that we manage, whether it's the systems we use internally, our ability to have a mobile workforce and the mobile devices, the remote connectivity, or even the connectivity with our business partners to allow us to do business more efficiently, all of that represents additional areas where we need to consider cyber risk. Now, there are some sectors that view, well, we don't really connect that much. We're disconnected from the internet. So the cyber threat is not as much of a concern for us. But we're also seeing that the malware and issues jumping across. So we all use thumb drives, or we know folks who use thumb drives if you don't. And we're seeing that being disconnected does not always mean you're immune to cyber threats. We're also seeing that the cybersecurity challenge is not just a technical challenge where we're worried about how are we securing and hardening desktops and servers and networks, but it's more than just a technical challenge. There's the human factors challenge, there's the policy challenge. And so what we're looking to do is really align how we address our cyber risk based on business needs. We're also concerned about finding usable solutions so that users won't become innovative and find workarounds and really defeat our cyber objectives. So another trend that we see that we think is troubling is that you don't necessarily have to be someone who's really tech savvy or a coder to use malware. It's available, it's more readily available, and we're even seeing that it can be customized to an attacker's needs. Here's an area where we feel, we're trying to do information sharing to promote good practices, and here's an area where the bad guys have no problem with information sharing. So this is a challenge that we have. And then third, the threat is becoming more dangerous. So we're seeing the will to actually do destructive attacks. And so we've seen this with Saudi Aramco in 2012, and we saw this with the attacks on the financial services sector. But I also want to highlight, we're not just focused on those intentional acts, but we're focused on unintentional cyber threats. And we want to make sure we're managing our cyber risk for both. Our aim really is to ensure that we're able to deliver critical functions and continue our critical operations in the face of the cyber threats. Really, we want to be sure, we want to have capabilities across all 16 sectors to manage cyber risk. So there's a statement up on the screen, and that came from the President's statement last month in conjunction with the release of the framework, essentially saying that cyber threats pose one of the gravest national security dangers that the United States faces. For us, this is clearly a priority, and we're seeing that it's not just a priority within the government and across the federal government, but across state and local government, but then also across industry and within businesses. We are specifically looking at, again, managing cyber risk. And we have been doing some outreach and engagement. In fact, the President has met with CEOs just to talk about this very issue. Some of the feedback that we've been getting is increased awareness within businesses, but then that there are some questions that are being asked from the C-suite and the boards. So, for example, companies are starting to ask, what is our exposure to cyber threats? If we are exposed, what's the business impact? And then, is what we're hearing about in the news, could that happen to us? And also, what are we doing about it? So, because of this threat, last February, the President issued executive order, let's see if we change here, executive order 13636 on improving critical infrastructure cybersecurity, along with the Presidential Policy Directive 21. And we've really been focused with our partners within critical infrastructure, both within the private sector and within the public sector, to take concrete steps in partnership to address the cyber threat. This is truly a shared responsibility, but I do get the question often, well, what's considered critical infrastructure? Am I considered critical infrastructure? So I'd like to take a moment to explain what our scope is. We're really referring to those functions that make up our critical infrastructure sectors and the ecosystem that supports it. And we are starting to refer to this really as our critical infrastructure community. So for example, within a given sector, if we take oil, the energy sector, that's broken up into oil and natural gas or electricity subsector. Well, then you can take just the electricity subsector and then break that down into functions. So you can break that down into distribution, generation, and transmission. Then there's a whole set of partnerships and services that help to make delivery of that service possible. What we're looking at really is the ecosystem, including all the organizations that support and enable delivery of critical infrastructure services. So this is taking into account also local, regional, and national considerations. So with that context, I'd like to lead into more detail on what we focused on through the executive order. Consistent with our National Infrastructure Protection Plan that was released at the end of the year, actually, at the end of 2013, the vision there was for a secure and resilient critical infrastructure. And through the executive order, we really aim to strengthen our capabilities across the sectors to identify, assess, and manage cyber risk. And we wanted to do this really focusing in three main areas: information sharing, adoption of cybersecurity practices, and then doing all of that while protecting privacy and civil liberties. And that's what we'll talk a little bit more about today. As it relates to information sharing, we have taken some concrete steps to improve how the government shares information with key stakeholders within critical infrastructure. Feedback that we commonly got was the need to share more unclassified information, more quality information in a more timely manner. And so we've partnered with within the federal government to improve our processes to be able to share more and to do that in a more timely manner. We've also worked, and DHS has revised processes within their private sector clearance program to expedite provision of clearances for critical infrastructure companies. And then we've also worked to expand some services to enable critical infrastructure owners and operators to better protect themselves. However, we do believe that the business-to-business sharing is very valuable, and we encourage that in engaging in information sharing forums such as ISACs with US CERT and other trusted partners. But we're really here to talk about the framework, so I'll transition more to that. With our objective with the framework was really to raise the bar and the level of cybersecurity capabilities to manage the risks that we're faced with. And we feel that, again, while information sharing is a key component and important, it's also most effective when it's coupled with having cybersecurity capabilities and adoption of practices. So some of the practices that we're promoting are known practices and not necessarily new breakthroughs, but the framework presents them in a way that's business focused and also presents a common lexicon for viewing these practices. But some of what we're looking at, some of the practices, just to give you a taste, are knowing what and how we are using information and information systems to support our business and delivery of critical functions. Applying appropriate standards and guidelines to protect against and detect cyber threats, and then know how well we're managing them. Addressing any gaps we identify, and then, by the way, looking for that and continuous improvement in doing it throughout the security life cycle. Monitoring for anomalous or unexpected activity, having a plan B, so an incident response or continuity plan, and by the way, practicing that plan, exercising it. These are just some examples of the types of practices that are included within the framework. So today, we are really focusing more on, not more, but we're focusing, in addition to promoting awareness of the framework, we want to promote use of the framework. So before we go into too much detail on the framework, I wanted to move it over to discuss privacy with my colleague Naomi, to talk a little bit more, in more detail, about how we address privacy. I mentioned that privacy and civil liberties was one of the aspects that was directed in the EO. So Naomi, if you could talk to that.
Okay, thanks, Samar. So how many people have actually read the privacy section? Okay, so, all right, well, as Samara said, the EO directed us to include a methodology to protect individuals' privacy and civil liberties, and essentially to mitigate the, the impact on them arising from cybersecurity activities. And since there are a lot of law students in the audience, it's section 7C, if you care. So if you want to see the exact language. But I think the more important question is to ask, why should we care, right? I mean, we want to stop terrorists, we want to stop bad guys, we want to stop criminal organizations. What does it matter? We should do everything we can to take measures to stop those bad activities. But what the EO is really saying is that it is important and it's possible to preserve key values around privacy and civil liberties while conducting cybersecurity activities. So, you can ask, there's an impact, right? There's an impact when you're doing monitoring on people. And I don't know how many of you may remember a few years ago, but in San Francisco, they shut down the communications in the BART system. There's an impact on us. Maybe you're an employee and you are a part-time farmer and you're doing a search on fertilizer and you get caught up in some kind of filter. There's an impact on our lives. So, those of us in the privacy field, really care, right? I think we can do both, and that's really what the EO is directing us to do. So what we set out to do was to find out what are those best practices, what are those standards that will help, that organizations are already using, in fact, to mitigate against those kinds of risks while they're doing legitimate cybersecurity activities. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history and background of the development because it really highlights some important and interesting difficulties and work to be done about how we can better integrate privacy and cybersecurity. So the end result in this final framework was a process-based methodology, and we layered around, we framed it with a context around the kinds of privacy considerations, some of which I just raised, and how we can use privacy principles to address them. But that's not actually where we started, and so the path was kind of interesting. So we first did a request for information. We asked for comments, and we asked about privacy, and we asked about the kinds of practices organizations use, and then we conducted went to a number of workshops and asked similar questions. So the answers that we got back were privacy is very important, but not a lot of detail. And in fact, many, especially in the sort of the security space, sort of viewed privacy as a matter of data security. And so we might get answers like, well, we know we comply with, state data breach notice laws, so that's privacy, right? So we're done. And so in short, privacy was really seen as sort of, it's very compliance oriented, and and they didn't view it the way they viewed security, which is sort of treated as a risk management process. So I'll keep that in mind. I will come back to that point. So the initial methodology that we put out in the preliminary framework, based not off of a lot of feedback at this point from industry, was designed to map to the core, which I guess you'll hear a little bit more about, but anyway, there are certain functions, and we wanted to provide some color around the privacy considerations as you were going through the various categories, and help organizations understand how privacy was more than just data security. And we also tried to introduce some what we call informative references, which are standards. So if you look at the current methodology and you look at the core, you'll see that there's a column that includes a number of standards that organizations can use to help them, conduct, the activities in that particular category. But when we looked and we asked, we didn't find a lot of standards, a lot of technical standards on how to do privacy or best practices on how to mitigate these risks. So this became a very important point, and we ended up having to call this out in a roadmap with the final framework, that there's a real gap here around having technical privacy standards to help people mitigate risks. So what we have today in privacy, if you're familiar with the Fair Information Practice Principles, are a set of high-level principles and frameworks and in various iterations of the FIPS, essentially. But those are really hard to implement, right, in a repeatable and measurable way, which is obviously something that NIST cares about very much. So that makes it hard for organizations to compare best practices and try to come to some consistent agreement about, for example, if you're sharing information about an incident, how much information do you need to share? How much personal information do you need to share in order to effectively convey information about the incident? And so organizations vary widely, which means that your privacy is impacted widely depending on the organization. But if we had a standard around a format for what information is effective to be shared, we would be able to get more consistency across organizations. So as I said, we've called that out in the roadmap as an area for future work. So getting back to the development. So the initial methodology finally got industry's attention, and we finally began discussion, around industry, trying to get industry consensus, which had been developing in the rest of the framework. So it was a bit of a concern because we're now sort of some months behind the process. But the main issues were that there was, feasibility around the implementation and how it integrated with the rest of the framework. And another key issue was civil liberties. You remember I said that the EO specifically called out privacy and civil liberties. So I will come back to that point on the civil liberties because there was a lot of discussion on that. So during the comment period around the preliminary framework, there was an alternate methodology that was process-based. It was submitted. It gained a lot of support. And so that's really how that methodology came about. And as I said, we wanted to maintain, though, sort of that educational value that we had in the initial methodology. And so we framed a discussion around considerations and how to use the principles so that it would make sense when an organization went to create a process that they would sort of understand what the risks were around privacy. Okay, so I said I would come back to the issue on civil liberties. So the discussions went sort of like this. There was a number of private sector organizations that felt that civil liberties, being a compact between citizens and the government, right? So it's a responsibility of the government to provide them. And I don't know if you know what sort of the breakdown in the critical infrastructure is, but is it like 80% is private sector? So reading between the lines, that was sort of like a, we don't need to worry about civil liberties, right? That, most of us, doesn't really need to be here. But there are other companies that, particularly global companies that take this view that having global principles is actually valuable for their business, in the global marketplace. But, and you can take a look at the methodology, but we did eventually find this sort of middle ground where we recognize that, governments and agents of the government, do need to have a process to support their compliance with privacy laws, regulations, and constitutional requirements. But, I think we will continue to see a lot of continued attention around this issue of how we actually, mitigate risks around civil liberties and integrate that into cybersecurity activities. So I want to make one sort of final point. So it became really clear through this process that there remains, a lot of work to be done in the privacy field, and that we're really missing some fundamental models and tools before we can really begin to implement these high-level privacy principles in ways that are repeatable and measurable. But on the good side, we can actually look to the process that we went through and the way we work in security, in the security field. And there's some really valuable analogies there, because if we begin to think about privacy in terms of, privacy threat models, so, what are the risks to privacy? That could enable us to develop a risk management model. And in turn, it could lead to, just as we do in security, we can develop privacy requirements that can be designed into systems. And at that point, we'd actually be in a position to identify the places where technical privacy standards would be beneficial. So at that point, I'd say that NIST will be holding a privacy engineering workshop in April 9th and 10th to continue this discussion around these issues and how we can move this forward so we welcome everybody to join that and continue that discussion. I think it's really interesting, to move from a place of, compliance orientation to actually designing privacy into systems, at the system level, and really think about it as a risk management process rather than a compliance process.
Thank you, Naomi.
Sure.
So before we go into a description of the framework, I just want to note that, again, the framework was really aimed at a risk-based approach to determine that right balance of measures or practices to help us identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And you'll see that clearly represented within the framework. This is an area where industry has been working to address for years, and we see that evidenced by the existence of globally recognized standards such as the ISO 27000 series or the ISA 99 or IEC 62443 standards. It's a great example of this. So next we'll have John Boyens to talk to us a little bit more about what the framework does and what the framework is comprised of.
Thanks, Mara. Before I go to the slides too quick, I'm going to take a step back, because really I think to understand what the framework is, what it's intended to do, what we hope it will do, I think we need to go back a little bit and really look at the intent of the executive order, and starting there, look at the process of how the framework was actually developed. So, as Samara was saying, it's the executive order and the framework was really intended to raise the tide, right? It's to get all those 16 sectors to raise the security profile. It wasn't an attempt to blue sky security to change the security paradigm. Is really to raise the security profile of all the different sectors. And it's with the belief that you don't have to balance security and competitiveness and innovation, that you can actually have all three, right? That actually security is what enables a lot of the innovation and competitiveness. So that's the executive order gave us the parameters to work under. And it wasn't just, an accident. Samara was very much involved in the development of the executive order and engaging with, the stakeholders in the development. And so it's not an accident that the executive order asks that the framework be voluntary, first and foremost. And I think that's going to be a theme that we're going to be, I'll keep mentioning throughout, because it's extremely important to how we got here and what it is and where we want to go. The other parameters: repeatable, cost-effective, flexible, and based off of international standards, recognizing that in today's global economy that companies are global companies with global supply chains operating all over the world. So basically, the parameters that we were giving in the development were 2 scoops of ice cream that is under 100 calories, right? It's the perfect dessert that you can possibly have. Tastes great, doesn't have too many calories. But the question was, how were we actually going to get there? And we had a year time frame. And so one of the reasons why NIST was asked to lead the facilitation and everything is because of the history that we have with working with the industry and facilitating some of these hard challenges. So some of our history is in the smart grid, the cloud space. So over the last year, we've engaged industry. We've had 5 workshops around the country. We've had 2 requests for information that have garnered over 4,500 comments from roughly 300 different entities. But it was this engagement that the success of the engagement was really founded off the fact that we made it very clear from day one that it was a voluntary framework. And it was the fact that it was a voluntary framework that the stakeholders really came forward and tried to make a very good, balanced tool for cybersecurity risk management. And it was that, I think, that trust that we gained throughout the entire process that moving forward is really going to make it successful. So it's that voluntary nature that I think we're going to keep coming back to, which is really the key to the development and the key to the success moving forward. Digging down into a little bit, and for those that haven't read the framework yet, I don't want to dig too deep, but I will make some of those linkages to what it is intended to do, how we kind of got to that point. So first and foremost, it's intended to be a tool to help organizations manage cybersecurity risk. And how do we do that? Samara mentioned the 5 functional areas, and that's the identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. And those are the 5 functional areas that we think that any cybersecurity risk management processes should have. And these are the 5 fairly basic, easy to understand categories that really tie into that business mission, C-suite level that can be understood from a business risk perspective. So we take those 5 functional areas and we break them down into outcome-based categories and subcategories that tie specifically into different international standards and widely used best practices that are adopted worldwide. So as Samara mentioned, it's nothing new, but it's the actual approach and the framework and everything that we're trying to develop that is the new aspect, because it creates a common lexicon of understanding that can be used as a communication tool within an organization and within and between partner organizations. I mean, for those that are security professionals, you understand in many areas, different sectors and different subsectors speak different languages when they're talking security. So it's a key component and key use of the framework. The second key aspect of the framework, moving from the core, Let me go back. I'm just going to throw that up there. So that is the core elements and how the different functions tie into the different informational references or informative references. So the second key aspect of the framework is really the concepts of creating profiles and target profiles. And the profiles and target profiles are really the implementation and link between the filling in the different categories and subcategories and the informative references based off of the business functions and mission as well as risk appetite. So it's really the implementation of, or it can be specific implementations, creating a profile. It could be either an organization-wide or different parts of an organization-wide could fill these out. And then developing a target profile is really looking at where you are currently with your profile and where you think you may need to go. Again, tying in those business mission needs, the risk assessments, and that's where the cost effectiveness goes in, right? So if you're an organization and you're looking at, this is where I am currently, this is where I need to go, you can make those cost effective decisions based on risk. The third key element of the framework is really the concept of the framework implementation tiers. And that's really allowing an organization to look at its risk management processes and see where it really sits. And so we're not encouraging organizations saying that they have to be a 4. We are saying, encouraging organizations that they move beyond a 1 into at least a 2, but beyond that, whether an organization is a 2, 3, or 4 is going to really be based off its where it sits in its environment, its threats, its operational environment, and it's going to need to determine those factors itself. But this at least allows an organization to look to see where it sits along the risk management processes. And though I would say it's not one of the key elements, I think it's fairly important. We have another section in the framework that's called really how to use, right? So, and it can be used in two key important ways. It can be used if you're a organization that is new to cybersecurity and you really don't know where to get started. You can use the framework and we give a step-by-step process on how to get going in cybersecurity and really pointing to some of those informative references. And we also, recognizing that across the 16 sectors in our society, that there's a lot of very technically mature organizations out there that are already doing a lot of this. A lot of them are required, a lot of them it's in their business interest, but they're very sophisticated, and we recognize that. So the second area of how to use is it allows some of these more technically mature organizations to be able to take the framework, and though they may be already doing all of this, they can map their current risk management processes into the framework and create their own profiles, and they can use this in different instances, again, different implementations, either internally within an organization, or they can start using this as a communication tool between themselves and some of their suppliers or some of the people that they are supplying products and services to. So again, I think there's different ways that the framework can be used. I think I've been probably talking a little bit too long there, so.
Yeah. So I think it's a good transition for Bob to really spend just a few minutes to talk about how to use or the voluntary program and focusing on using the framework, and then we'll go right into the Q&A.
Yeah, and so I'll be quick. I mean, I think the work that NIST has done to give industry, working with industry to give them a template to make risk-informed decisions about security investments on their cyber systems is crucial. And we'll, as we talk about questions, I mean, one of the things we in the Department of Homeland Security are most interested is doing whatever we can in a supporting role to critical infrastructure owners and operators to have them use the framework, have them use the framework as part of their business processes, and have them use the framework to make decisions on how to elevate the level of cybersecurity and cyber systems. So Samara talked a lot about this. I would just say from a Department of Homeland Security perspective, we think this is a major national security issue. We think the framework is an excellent part of the business processes that will eventually lead immediately and in the future to investments toward elevating the level of cybersecurity across a whole wide range of stakeholder community. And we're doing some specific things that I'm happy to talk about in Q&A to support that happening, but the framework really does give us, for the first time as a nation, something to define where we are individually as entities in terms of cybersecurity and where we want to go collectively. It's a tool to get there collectively. The second part that I think the Department of Homeland Security really can bring to the table is, along the lines of what Samara was talking about, is improving the ability to share information about the threats that we see in the cyber systems on our cyber networks, on our other government cyber networks, and aggregating and anonymizing and collecting the information that private sector organizations are seeing as they relate to cybersecurity threats, and giving us a much better understanding of the cyber threat landscape. The other area of information sharing that's important is understanding where our vulnerabilities are, where cyber incidents can have the most significant consequences. We've looked at areas. We understand that, cyber incidents on things like the electricity sector and the communication sector really have the potential for some really serious risks. We can help understand the individual threats. We can help understand general vulnerabilities, and we can help in the department sort of help overall mitigate the risks to all critical infrastructure sectors, but understand how the consequences might play out. So we don't get to the place where a cybersecurity incident becomes a national, major national, becomes a catastrophe, becomes a regional catastrophe, has the same kind of impact on the operations and physical impact that we've seen that can be caused by other threat vectors. And so we think this is a crucial moment. Let's keep cybersecurity, let's raise the level of cybersecurity, let's keep cyber incidents from becoming sort of cascading physical incidents. And that's really what we're about, what all this work's leading us to. And so at DHS, our job is to help support industry, work with NIST, work with others to do that in a lot of different ways, and I'll leave the rest for sort of questions, because it really is making sure that that we continue to use what we put together to advance the level of security as a nation.
Thank you. Zach.
So thank you all very much for coming. This was an incredibly detailed discussion, but I wonder if it might sort of, maybe we could have done this at the beginning, to tie it at a bit higher level of abstraction to the threats themselves. So every day we're reading about Russian organized crime groups that steal hundreds of millions of dollars, about Chinese state-linked hackers, about Iranian sort of groups linked to the state. So I have sort of two questions. One for Bob, if you could just sort of describe in a little bit more detail the threats, what they are, and what these various groups seek, and just sort of put everything sort of in strategic context. And then for Naomi, if you could maybe talk a little bit about the specific kinds of privacy and civil liberties harms that people are worried about in cybersecurity specifically. So everybody's read the papers and seen what Snowden has showed us all. And so I think we understand in certain contexts what the privacy and civil liberties concerns are. But when you're talking about a cybersecurity framework that's specifically aimed at the private sector and at companies, about how they do business, what are the privacy concerns that you were most concerned about?
Sure, thanks, Zach. So talking, I mean, why lexicons are so important and why words matter is cybersecurity and cyber incidents cover a whole range of things that are done for very different reasons. So let's talk about a little bit of what we're seeing in cyberspace. So one level, and you mentioned Russians, and this is generally associated with Eastern Europeans. There's a degree of that it's cyber crime, and it's high-speed cyber criminals who are offering, for a lack of a better analogy, are operating somewhere similar to a mafia or organized crime type structure, and they are doing what they can to get information about individuals, about corporations, and sell that largely for the profit motive. And so cybercrime is one thing that we see. Another thing that we see is, and so when you think about that, that's like a lot of other transnational criminal organizations, and you gotta think about it in that phrase. Another thing we see is sort of, things that are annoyances, hacktivism, which, activism for a number of different reasons, where there's defacement of websites, where there's causing, these minor things that could have reputational damage. There's that sort of stuff. There's the theft of intellectual property, which is, again, done largely for business reasons, particularly in places like the defense industrial base, where we see real efforts to come in and to exploit corporate secrets or, government secrets for the purpose of, again, largely, taking that intellectual property and moving into other space. We're seeing that. And then you have, I think, the categories that start to go more toward traditional national security are nation-state activities where there is a degree to which they are operating our systems to prove they can operate on our systems with the possibility that they may do something later, and I won't go into the specific nation-states and things like that, but you're seeing that. You're seeing evidence of them trying to exploit our systems largely to prove they can exploit our system, not necessarily to go in and do damage yet in terms of the nation state. You're worried that may change, and then you have sort of the nexus between capability and the terrorist organizations or potential terrorist organizations who may be interested in, again, we're not seeing that much of it, but maybe interested in, trying to exploit some of this capability for other purposes, for the purposes of achieving more traditional terrorist aims. So that's the landscape. I think what makes it an interesting strategic moment is that all of those are different drivers, and there are different ways you deal with it. And again, you can look for analogies, but it doesn't feel like a stable moment, right? It feels like all of these things can change for a lot of different reasons, and you see, you see the speculation in the news that something changes in geopolitical situations, like has recently with the Ukraine and Russia, and you worry what are the cascading impacts of the threat space that we're seeing. We know this is out there. How is this going to change? That's why information sharing, intelligence are so important. That's why putting these plans in place now before the tactics and techniques and motivations change. And a lot of what we're trying to do is to, before this becomes an absolute national crisis, have upped our game on that.
And just to follow up for a second, so how is the framework that you guys described this evening, sort of which of those 3 or 4 different categories of threats that you just described is this attempting to address?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's that simple. So you're talking about threats, which is one aspect of the equation of risk, right? So you have the threat, you have the vulnerability, you're going to have the likelihood, and then you have the impact. And so you can't deal with just threats from a technical level, and I would say that the motivations of the threats are even only one very small aspect of threats, right? There's from a NIST, from a technical perspective, we deal much better with attack vectors, right? The actual technologies that the threats are coming from, the actual vulnerabilities. I mean, you can't control threats. That's the one thing. Threats are always going to be changing. You can try to understand them, and you can try to understand how they're targeting different vulnerabilities. But with it's difficult to generalize because different organizations are going to have different threats, different vulnerabilities, and the mix between those definitely with, over 16 different very diverse sectors, you're going to have different impacts. So I think what the framework does is try to look at it fairly holistically and not on an individual specific basis. And that's, so I would emphasize that the framework is version 1.0, that it was specifically developed by the stakeholders to do certain things. It was not developed to do other things. Many of the things that I think that you're getting at are items that need to be dealt with further down the road at different levels, particularly at sector-specific levels and by different sectors. So I think that's kind of where we're going there. At the same time, I think that we want to engage so that when we move on into version 2.0, we can have more of this conversation, right? And what can we do with the framework versus how the different sectors and organizations deal with threat and vulnerability specifically.
Right. So, I tried to give a little bit of a flavor, but, to be clear, what we're talking about, right, is when, risks, privacy risks and civil liberties risks arise from when personal information is used or collected or disclosed or maintained in connection with an organization's cybersecurity activity. So we're not talking about privacy writ large, but nonetheless, I mean, there's a whole variety of ways that risks can arise. So, a utility company may be, monitoring smart meters, right, to make sure that somebody hasn't inserted malware. But, what might they be learning about your energy usage, right? And what might that reveal about your behaviors inside your house? So, and so then the question becomes, what do they do with that? Maybe, they need to do that monitoring, but, they don't necessarily need to do anything else with that information, or they don't need to retain it, or they can anonymize it. There's all kinds of things that they could do to mitigate those risks. Another example is, what should you share? What kind of information sharing should you do? Should you just turn over everything in order to share about the incident, or should you, try to figure out what is actually material to the incident? Because maybe you turn over some communications that demonstrate somebody committed some petty crime, and then, remember, law enforcement, then should that be passed to law enforcement? Should they take action on that? This is information that they would not otherwise have had, right, without probable cause or subpoena. So there's all kinds of chains of effects that can arise from doing very good and important cybersecurity activities. But if we consider what those long-term risks are, just the chilling effect, right, that can be had on freedom of expression or association from monitoring communications. So it's not to say that we shouldn't do those activities, but that we can think about the impact and the ways and the policies and the technologies that we can use to mitigate those impacts.
Yes.
I'm Amanda Cushman. I teach at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm the Federal Trade Commission's Senior Policy Advisor on Privacy and Security. My names are mine, not the FTC's. So this is clearly a very important first step in jumpstarting the national conversation around information security. So it's fantastic. One point that I'd like to hear some thoughts about, if you can share with us, this is a description of a great process-based model, but one aspect I didn't hear mentioned is the unfortunate reality that many companies ignore vulnerability reports when they come in and choose not to fix their systems. So would you have any thoughts that you can share with us about that darker side of security improvements and what the best practices would be for a company in interacting with security researchers, and what types of concerns you can see articulated perhaps in future frameworks around those issues of vulnerability reporting, fixing existing vulnerabilities, particularly when we're talking about well-known vulns, not the 0 days and PO days or different, but around this relationship of security vulnerability researchers and companies that perhaps have a history of not fixing their vulnerabilities by choice.
I mean, I would go back to the main point that Samar was making at the beginning, is that we are trying to raise awareness and link these cybersecurity processes to the business risk, right? So that it is in the organization's self-interest to actually look at some of these cyber risks and address some of those vulnerabilities for its overall mission, that it is in its own self-interest. Now, if you're saying that organizations are unaware of this, I think that's one of the things that we're trying to do is raise that awareness. If you're indicating that organizations specifically knowingly choose to not do it, even though it ultimately is in its own business interest, I guess I haven't spoken with any of those companies myself.
So there's a distinction, right, between vulnerabilities in terms of you got a vulnerability in your network and vulnerabilities that you have a vulnerability in your software or something that you're selling that's part of your business model. And I think largely what we're talking about here is working with owners and operators who are using things and saying, hey, here's a vulnerability. You know, we've seen this analogy in working on physical vulnerabilities, and I think John's model is right, that hey, most organizations are interested in addressing their vulnerabilities to the extent that they know about them and that it is somewhat cost effective to address their vulnerabilities, or it's affordable to address their vulnerabilities. If you get to a point where you see things where people are saying, look, we're just not going to address the vulnerabilities, then it becomes a question of, at least from my perspective, at what level is the national interest and what are some other levers to get them to address the vulnerabilities. I mean, certainly sitting here as national security professionals, if the vulnerability is too big and we know about it, we will try to use whatever levers, working in a voluntary context, educating, trying to figure out ways, and if not, you know, at what point do we step in and take more active things if it rises to a certain level of risk?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on that voluntary point. This is something that you landed on, very hard, voluntary first and foremost, and I get why you would do that to bring people into the process. But I know that was a little bit disappointing for some people seeing it as purely voluntary. So I'm wondering a couple of things. You know, I know you decided not to go with something more strongly regulatory, and that was a big decision that was made. Do you see that as a possibility in the future? If you don't see enough implementation? I know that there's some incentives that are being developed or thought about to get people to really, follow up on this right and implement it. Just wondering if, we can hear anything about that. And on the
Sure.
third point, I'm thinking, I know there's a lot of hope that there's some private sector incentives that can really drive some of this. And I'm wondering where the real, what do you have the most faith in there? What are the real private sector incentives that are going to drive this?
Okay, so I'll start with the first one. So as I captured it, the first one relates to the voluntary nature of the framework. And so as we reiterated, it is a voluntary framework, and we're taking the voluntary approach. Now, and we're seeing movement, voluntary movement already. There are some sectors that are currently regulated already, and for those sectors with existing regulation, what we're doing is asking them to review their regulation and to be clear, to clarify, what we've laid out within the executive order is direction to executive branch agencies. And don't want to get too much into the weeds, but that's important because many of the regulators are independent regulators. And so our activity in this space, we cannot direct, we can only encourage or invite them to do similar activities. But where we have existing cybersecurity regulation, we are not seeking to expand regulation. What we are seeking to do is to harmonize existing cybersecurity regulation with each other. So we hear of organizations that are considered members or belong to multiple sectors that have different requirements, and so there's definitely some interest in harmonizing with across existing regulations, but then harmonizing to the framework. We definitely see some efficiencies that could be obtained there. For those other sectors, we are really throwing our weight behind and really working with voluntary measures and voluntary programs to move forward. Now, in the framework, I'm sorry, not in the framework, in the executive order, there was some work that we did to really look at Section 9 for those who followed it very closely. There's some work that we did to do analysis of where, within a sector where there could be a catastrophic impact as a result of a cyber event. And there we identified, a relatively small subset. And for that subset, many of those entities were already under existing cybersecurity regulation. So we feel really supportive of the voluntary approach. After 2 years, we will look and see for that subset of sectors identified, how well has the voluntary approach worked. We'll look at how well have we been able to harmonize and streamline against existing regulations. And so that's something in the future. But we are starting to see movement and progress from the voluntary approach.
I think in terms of the incentives, in the market driver incentives, again, we like to say that this is going to make sense if it makes sense for businesses to make the decision. And the government can do a few things maybe to make it sense for businesses to make decisions to use the framework and invest in it, but I think largely that's going to happen in a business context without a lot of government involvement. But the one I think we hear most frequently, and call it an incentive or call it a driver, I'm not sure which it is businesses talking about working with their suppliers and as part of their supply chain, both up and down their supply chain, to have confidence that the folks they're buying things from or the folks using their services have good cybersecurity in place, use the framework to drive processes. And so while we continue to want to work on other market drivers like insurance and things like that, I think the immediate one that we expect to see more, and we'll do what we can within our own government procurement policy to do that as well, but it is really the supply chain relationship and the provider-supplier relationship as being a driver. And you hear that from industry a lot.
I think another incentive, and this is more of a direct incentive, we talk about technical assistance, and Bob didn't get to go into some of his points, but DHS is working to provide managed services, and maybe you can talk a bit to that, because that's an incentive area that is being established and set up now for state and local government, but there's the potential for that to impact broader. So if you want to
so we in DHS will provide, using our contracting and purchasing power, will provide free managed security services to state governments who use the framework. So not only, because ultimately, philosophically, using the framework, and I mentioned this in my opening remarks, using the framework, but using the framework to elevate the level of security, making risk-based decisions to get there is important. And if you can lower the costs of acquiring security service or access to acquire security service, that's a pretty big incentive for adopting the framework and taking it in place. So we can start with state governments, that's within our own processes that we have in place and in our own budget, but hopefully ideas like this will take off across the marketplace.
Yep.
There's a question.
Question related to what you were saying, in the sense that in the previous question, the level of threat seems to be highest in the larger organizations, you mentioned that, and the incentives that you're talking about seem to be possible at the state level. So how do you see this affecting smaller businesses, both on the threat level lower with smaller entities, and also what kind of incentives would you provide to the lowest level of the community?
Right, so I'd like to start with a response that also ties in part of your question. Another incentive, market-based incentive that we're hopeful will have an impact is we're starting to see it from the supply side. And so we're hearing of service providers, product providers aligning their products and services to enable companies to use the framework and have the capabilities to address the practices in the framework inherently. So, we're hopeful that will also be an incentive. I don't think that it's accurate to say that the threats are targeted just at the large companies. I don't know that size, it's not so much about the size of an organization, but about the potential consequence and impact of the organization. So for example, we know that there may be some in the research community that are doing some really innovative research and some really attractive things that folks may be interested in, that intellectual property, that are definitely being targeted. they're small. But you also have the threats to the larger companies. So it's not so much in looking at the size of an organization, but really what is it that, what's the consequence and what it is that they're doing.
I would also add that if you look at some of the threat reports, most notably the 2013 Semantic and Mandiant reports, you'll find that some of the smaller supplier companies are being targeted as a supply chain into the larger organizations.
And I've framed it a couple times today. Why aren't these companies necessarily investing in cybersecurity? It's perhaps a lack of knowledge that the cybersecurity threats out there or what to do, and I think the framework is very helpful in that. It's a lack of expertise, even if you want to take it on feeling like you have the capability within the organization. I think there are things we can collectively do toward workforce development and bringing tools and technical assistance to make more capability, and or there's just a lack of feeling of affordability related to that, and that's where you look at financial incentives and things like that, or lowering the cost of security services. But we can address it through those three ways, and it's not just giving them more money to go do something. It's you gotta couple that with understanding what to do and the knowledge and building the capabilities. So we've learned that a lot in our Homeland Security grants. Don't pour money in if you're not going to be there 2 years later. If the money's not going to be there 2 years later, because all you did was buy a bunch of stuff that you don't know how to use and you can't sustain and things like that. And so we got to think long term.
We have time for one more question. Well, I guess we're done. Oh, okay. Thank you.
Given that cybersecurity is one of international issues more than just the U.S., have you done any work in terms of collaboration with outside governments, EU, for example, people you work with, or some benchmarking the things I'm sure they're doing right now as well to kind of figure out kind of direction we're going to better deal with any of this from their perspective as well?
So, just the same with privacy. Different countries take different approaches to cybersecurity, both from the government perspective as well as their critical infrastructure. We are taking a voluntary approach, but over the last year, and even before that, we have constantly been talking with other countries about their approach, and we are. Right now, we're working very closely with our U.S. domiciled countries who have global operations and working with them as well as the other foreign governments to actually make sure that the framework is aligned, right? They're not going to be perfectly matched, they're not going to be harmonized, but we want to make sure that whatever approach we have here in the United States, that it still allows our companies to operate overseas as best they can.
Okay. All right. Last one.
You mentioned the cybersecurity issue is basically a voluntary one on the part of the federal government. Why aren't there more discussions to mandate supply chain security in the sense that if there were an attack, say, on the utility grid and something catastrophic happened, it would be a situation where the discussion following an incident of that nature would be to say, we would have to mandate these kinds of protections and put it in the federal statute. Why are we waiting for some catastrophe to happen before more definitive action is taken? And you mentioned that in certain industries they have mandated requirements. In the financial industry, they have the PCI standard. In terms of personal information, you have HIPAA standards. But for protecting infrastructure, supply chain, there's no structure that is other than voluntary.
So there are a host of existing cybersecurity regulations. In the financial services, there's several regulators for financial services. For electricity, so for the bulk power system, that is heavily regulated by the NERC SIP standards by FERC. FERC oversees that. Within healthcare, there are healthcare regulations. Within the nuclear regulatory, within the chemical sector, there are regulations. So there are a set of existing cybersecurity regulations in place, and mostly driven, I would say to date, based on consequence and impact. But there are existing cyber regulations in place. And so what we're looking to do now is work voluntarily to go beyond regulation, where the regulated environment, to continue more broadly to raise the level of cybersecurity across.
There's the ideological, do you believe in voluntary regulatory question, which everyone can form their own opinion. There's also the question of how do you keep this from being a compliance culture? And I think part of the answer is we want to keep, this is evolving too quickly, it's too flexible a threat, too dynamic a threat. The solutions are still relatively unstable. It's not the same as how do you protect a building. And so we you know, in addition to sort of what we hear from industry, we do fundamentally want to keep this as flexible as possible so that we can be responsive to the change. And you can argue whether regulation allows you to do that or not, but certainly that's part of the conversation too. So it's not just, can we get regulation? It's what's the best solution for the threat we're facing right now.
Okay. Well, I'd like to send you home with the following little story. The original cyber sleuth, Sherlock Holmes, went camping with his assistant Watson, and they pitched a tent in the forest and went to sleep. In the middle of the night, Holmes woke up, looked up and saw the stars, woke up Watson, said, "Watson, wake up. What do you see?" Watson said, "I see stars." Sherlock Holmes said, "What do you make of that?" "Well, there are billions of gaseous objects up in the sky having fusion, fusion, and they're generating light and heat, and it's an amazing phenomena." And Sherlock Holmes looked at Watson and he said, "Watson, you idiot, somebody stole our tent." So I think that you should all read the Cybersecurity Framework. It's an easy read, and sometimes the solution to a complex problem is much easier and more obvious than you may think. And I think that our panelists here and their teams back in the government have done a phenomenal job generating something that we can all use to make a safer country. So join me in thanking our panelists.